Welcome back to Squeeze Play. Well, for the first time since the Cuban Revolution began more than 50 years ago, Cuban citizens will be able to buy cars and homes. But are these moves to open up the Cuban economy enough to kickstart the country's ailing economy? And what do these changes mean for investors? For more, we're joined by Larry Luxner. He's editor of CubaNews, and Mark Entwistle, the former Canadian ambassador to Cuba. Thank you both for joining us today.
Hi. Nice to be here. Thank you.
All right, Mark, let me start with you on this. The Cuban government just finished its six-party Congress and approved a number of what seemed to be very sweeping reforms, everything from allowing private property to allowing for more entrepreneurship, to basically we're going to see about 1 million people come off the government dole over the next little while. Can you give us a sense, though, of how really revolutionary these changes are going to be for this economy?
Absolutely, Andrea. I think the first thing to bear in mind is we have to do a little bit of expectation management when it comes to Cuba. We have a tendency to, sort of as Westerners, so to speak, to extrapolate our own wishful thinking onto the Cubans and onto the processes. This was a very important event. A number of those changes are real. They were in the talk shop for a long time in Cuba. Cubans have been waiting for a number of them for quite some time. But the Cuban political leadership are not reformers, and I think we have to be. We often hear the term, well, there's going to be these reforms and economic reforms. These are fundamentally changes to make the existing system work better and to deal with some substantive public issues that have been identified through public consultation. It'll take a while for this to play out, without question. There's a time gap, if you will, between the broad policy approvals given at this party Congress and the regulatory frameworks that will follow. The Cubans do this very carefully. They do it slowly. There's nothing risky in terms of the way they manage these issues. So I think the trend lines are important. There's a general trend line to a liberalization of the domestic economy, to a creation of a kind of a fusion economy between state enterprise and a private sector, a services sector, a private services sector. And I think it'll take even a year, 2 years, 3 years for this to play itself out before we get a real sense of what it looks like. But it was important, and they retooled the relationship between the party, the Communist Party of Cuba, and the government as well. And essentially, Raul Castro told the party to back off the government.
Let's bring Larry into this. Larry, why now? Why has this government chosen this moment? Is it about problems, challenges within the Cuban economy, structural challenges? Is it about succession? Give us your sense about timing.
I think some of this has to do with events in Washington as well as Havana. You've had a substantial change with an election of President Obama, a Democrat. Also, there's been quite a bit of movement in the world economy. Things are much worse now for Cuba. The price of oil has increased dramatically. As you know, Cuba produces very little oil. It's totally dependent on Venezuela. At the same time, commodity prices have gone up sharply. So Cuba's food import bill is considerably higher than it was before, and that puts a squeeze on Cubans, on average people, which is one reason they've been talking about doing away with La Libreta, the ration card.
Mark, let me bring you back into this. So you go to Cuba quite often. Can you give us a sense of what state the Cuban economy is right now, and really if the economy is prepared for some of these changes, like getting rid of the ration card, like basically expelling 1 million people into what is a private sector that really doesn't exist?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's an excellent question. At a macro level, the Cuban economy is in quite rough shape. This will come as no surprise to anybody, and if you listen to to President Raul Castro, he would say the exact same thing. It's very tough on the street for Cubans, and it will be for some time. There's a number of policy decisions that will have to come as well to support decisions like what is essentially a mass layoff of people from public service jobs. to create this kind of retail sector to absorb a number of, to create new jobs and new employment. They're going to have to deal with the issue of capital. They're going to have to loosen their banking regulations. They're going to have to find the capital. They're going to have to deal with customs regulations, all of this kind of regulatory framework to follow. In addition, too, there's a kind of philosophical issue. The Cubans are used to having kind of cradle-to-grave, really welfare provisions, both in public health and subsidized food, subsidized rent, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to be a painful process that they have to manage very, very carefully here because the poorer segments of the Cuban population are the ones most at risk.
Larry, how do you think the U.S. government is viewing this? As you mentioned, there has been somewhat of an opening in relations since President Obama came on the scene. Do you think there's any possibility that the embargo could be lifted?
Absolutely not. I don't believe that there's any chance that the embargo will be lifted in this current presidency, and I'll tell you why. For one thing, I don't believe the Obama administration is very impressed with the changes in Havana. There's been very little change at the leadership level. Really, this is not a new generation of Cubans taking over. This is not this groundswell of youth that everybody's been hearing about. You have an 80-year-old man, a historical figure, taking the #2 spot in the Communist Party now, José Ramón Machado Ventura. And then you have the #3 spot is Ramiro Valdez, who is 79 years old. The #2 slot, he's even older than Raúl. So that's hardly a wave of generational change. As far as Washington is concerned, there have been some changes. You know, the OFAC, the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, has issued a new set of guidelines that regulate the travel of Americans to Cuba, not tourist, but humanitarian travel, people-to-people exchange, which we've been hearing quite a lot about. And yes, there are some changes in those regulations that kind of open the door. Certainly, Cuban Americans are now free to travel to Cuba with unlimited frequency, not like under the Bush administration. But no, I don't see any further change until the elections, and certainly until there's some substantial movement on the part of the Castro government on human rights. I don't think anything's going to change.
Mark, our next interview, we're going to talk about Syria and the uprisings there across the Middle East. What's your sense on the ground in Cuba? You know, this is a people, a nation that in many ways would look less benign than in Egypt, maybe closer to a Tunisia, yet we don't really see from the outside a desire for large-scale popular reform coming from the Cuban people, or is that just simply because we're not listening to the right voices?
Well, I think in general, Cubans are tired of the status quo, without question. Does that mean that the overriding priority of Cubans is political reform and political change? It doesn't. Public opinion polling in Cuba is very, very embryonic. It's at low scale. But all of the opinion polling that's been done and these kind of town hall meetings that they have regularly really do point out that that Cubans are particularly concerned in the short term about material well-being issues, about the buying and selling of the cars, the ability to create jobs, to have their own company, their own businesses, to have access to some of the goodies of life. That's really kind of the driving force. Cuba's not as isolated as we think it is, and I personally think there's a number of different factors at play in Cuba, which I don't see an Egypt or a Syria effect playing out in Cuba for a whole range of historic and political reasons.
Okay, well, here I have one final question, and I would like both of you to answer it if you can. Some of these reforms include introduction of special economic zones and allowing for long-term leasing of property in the tourism sector. I'll start with you, Larry. If you could just give me a sense of what do you think this is an opportune time for investors to get into Cuba?
Well, it's an opportune time for Canadian investors to get into Cuba. The United States, of course, is forbidden from this market. So in some sense, the embargo is a beautiful gift to our northern neighbors. I do believe that as time goes on, those opportunities will increase. For one thing, a number of Cuban Americans would like to retire in Cuba or at least have second homes there. It's only a 1-hour flight from Miami to Havana. And so, yes, I think the marinas that are being built, hotels, at some point might might even casinos. We don't know. But there are certainly tourism opportunities in Cuba, villas, long-term leasing. Our publication has written about a number of these projects, and some of them are in the $500 million to $1 billion range, and they're going to compete with the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, and Cancun. And some might even be more luxurious. All
right, Mark, we only have a few seconds left, but you're actually involved in several Cuban ventures. What's your sense on the ground? Is this a good place to be doing business?
Well, Cuba is a long-term strategic play, and you got to have a lot of internal fortitude. It's not an easy market, but the long-term trend lines to stability.
All right. Well, thanks to both of you for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And Rudyard, I just want to add that both of these gentlemen are actually going to be participating in an event that is going to be put on by the Canadian Council for the Americas at the end of May, May 30th in Toronto at Torrey's, the law firm downtown. Anybody looking for any more information on this, you can go to the CCA website. That's ccacanada.com. If you want to get more information about what the changes mean for Cuba and what it means for investors.
Yeah, it sounds like an interesting event. I think the big thing that this regime has going for it that the likes of Hosni Mubarak did not was the fear of all of those Cubans in Miami and their desire to return to Cuba to reacquire land, apartments, property, businesses. This has made allies in an interesting way of the Cuban people with this government, which in every way is a dictatorship, almost as worse as anything you see in the Middle East.
Well, that's the problem. It's kind of like the United States Palestine, which is why, as you can see, when you ask Americans whether the embargo is going to end anytime soon, the question is usually absolutely not.